Hello, everyone. Hi. Brilliant. So I think the session now is live. Thanks everybody for choosing to join us at this what we think obviously is particularly important session, which will be focused today on child poverty in the UK. I think it's a really important moment to be talking about child poverty in the UK, and we've got some really fantastic speakers who are going to have lots of valuable information to share with you, and we're really looking forward to hearing your questions as well after the speakers have done their initial presentations. So, as some of you might already know, 31% of children in the UK are currently living in poverty, and this unacceptable figure is due to rise further without urgent and ambitious action. Child poverty also isn't experienced equally, with some groups facing much higher rates and rates varying across different parts of the country as well. But crucially, for every child who grows up in poverty, the impacts are severe and long lasting. And I think we can all get behind a goal to eradicate child poverty in the UK, which is why the forthcoming child poverty strategy from the UK government is a really golden opportunity to take us much closer to that shared goal, and is something I'm sure we'll hear more from our speakers about today. We've got a brilliant panel, as I said, who will be sharing more about the scale, the drivers of child poverty, and crucially the solutions, and what government, private sector and third sector can do. And yeah, really looking forward to the discussion. So that's more than enough from me. I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Sara Ogilvie, Director of Policy Rights and Advocacy at the Child Poverty Action Group, to kick us off. Thanks, Sara.
Thanks very much. Kids going to school on empty tummies, missing out on trips, not choosing subjects because they can't afford the equipment. It's kids going back to a cold house, clothes that don't match the weather. It's not enough space or not enough heat in that home. We're talking about stressed out parents, isolated and worried children, worse physical and mental health, shorter life expectancy, higher rates of infant mortality. This is the reality of growing up in poverty in the UK. It's about day-to-day life and life chances, and sometimes it can literally be a matter of life or death. It's about kids who can't outrun child poverty because family income is still the strongest indicator of how well a child will get on at school. And it's a devastating 4.5 million children facing these circumstances across the country. I always think it's important to start with reminding ourselves what the reality of child poverty is before we talk about some of the technical stuff and talking about the solutions, because really sitting at the heart of this and sitting at our drive to make government take action on this is the fact that child poverty is fundamentally about kids and about their childhood, and it's something that we can and should be making better for as many children as we possibly can. If you want to understand a bit of the technicalities around child poverty, we have a measure or a line of child poverty, and that is calculated by looking at the number of families who are living on less than 60% of the median income. But the definition, and effectively, if you want to understand the cause of child poverty, it's worth looking at this. The definition is when the inevitable costs of having children come at a time when a family's ability to work or to work more in order to meet those costs is limited by the fact of having to look after children. Salaries don't change to reflect family size or the number of children that you have. And if you have kids, there are only so many hours that you can work in order to make up the difference between what you have in your salary packet and what you need to look after those kids. So employment is a really important part of the answer to child poverty, but because of those reasons, it can't be all the answer. And that means to support families through this vital but temporary period of their lives, we need social security. And it's not just common sense or logic that leads us to that conclusion. All the evidence shows that where you increase family incomes through social security, then child poverty goes down. And conversely, when you cut social security, child poverty goes up. A few examples of this: when the previous Labour administration invested in child tax credits and above inflationary social security rises, child poverty was cut by almost 1 million kids. During COVID, when the £20 uplift was introduced and then cut, around 300,000 kids initially fell out of poverty, then promptly fell back in. In the 15 years since austerity started in 2010, £40 billion less has been spent on social security every single year, with the majority of cuts focused on families with children through policies like the 2-child limit and the benefit cap, breaking that crucial link between what families need and what they get. So frankly, it's no surprise that child poverty is now at a record high when all that money has been taken out of their support systems. When we hear politicians say that austerity is over, frankly, austerity has never ended for these families who are forced to live on dramatically less than what they need. And crucially, austerity just will not end for the 109 extra children every day that fall into child poverty as a result of the 2-child limit alone. For as long as that policy remains in place, austerity is live and kicking for them. If we look to Scotland, the Scottish Government set child poverty reduction targets. In order to meet those targets, it has invested in the Scottish Child Payment, which is kind of a top-up to universal credit. It has taken steps to mitigate the benefit cap, and next year it will mitigate the 2-child limit. As a result, the rate of child poverty that you heard at a UK level from Beatrice is 31%. In Scotland, that's now down to 23%. So the positive take from this is that child poverty can be reduced, but it's really clear that it requires government to take action in order to do that. So we obviously strongly welcomed the UK government's manifesto commitment to reduce child poverty, and the PM has upped that commitment by describing tackling child poverty as the moral mission of his government. But children and families are in desperate need of help. It has been well over a year since that general election, and words cannot keep these families warm. The government's child poverty strategy has been delayed, but is due to be published around the time of the budget. And frankly, this is a once in a parliament opportunity to make the crucial difference for the next generation. Scrapping the 2-child limit, and I mean really scrapping it, no benefit cap, no 3-child limit, no compromise that undermines the effectiveness of that measure in reducing child poverty, is the bare minimum we need to see from this government, or else child poverty will continue to rise and it will be higher at the end of this parliament than at the start. But that really is only the bare bones of what children and families need. So we would encourage government to be bold and ambitious, setting a vision for significantly reducing and ending child poverty, targets for getting there, and a plan for making it happen. Fundamentally, if we believe in childhood, if we believe in children, if we believe that everyone deserves the best start in life, then it's time for government to put its money where its mouth is and make things better for the 4.5 million children who deserve better from them right now. I'll leave it there, Beatrice.
Thanks very much, Sara. Thanks for setting that out so clearly. I'm going to hand straight over to Rachel Walters, who runs the End Child Poverty Coalition, to tell us a bit about the coalition's work and their priorities at this really key moment for tackling child poverty in the UK. Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's lovely to be here. I manage something called the End Child Poverty Coalition, which, as the name suggests, is a group of almost 140 different organisations, charities, faith groups, trade unions, who all come together with the belief that child poverty isn't inevitable, and actually it's government choices that drive children into poverty, as we just heard from Sara a moment ago. This network of organisations comes together to campaign, and we call on the British government to make sure that policies are in place that are lifting families out of poverty. To do this work, we also work alongside a group of youth ambassadors, and this is 20 young people who have their own lived experience of growing up in a low-income family. They maybe grew up in a home where food was scarce, where parents struggled to pay bills, And I just wanted to share with you a very quick video where some of the youth ambassadors speak for themselves about what child poverty means for them. If you wouldn't mind playing the video, please.
Yeah, growing up in a low-income household is just like, it's just tough. It's like a lot of sacrifices, especially with siblings, missing out on trips, missing out on things, like even missing out on meals, like sacrificing like loads of things, having to go to the carpet sale to buy clothes, not having food on the table, knowing what time to use the lecky and like what time to not use the lecky. And even now, I was like, well, that's really, really weird. You bring it up to people at uni or like, you know, outside who haven't had those experiences, and they laugh and they think it's a joke, when in reality that was my whole world.
To grow up and to know that you have to lower your expectations and hopes in life, because if you have dreams, it just puts so much pressure on your family and on yourself, because dreams cost a lot of money.
What's really pertinent with the 2-child limit at the minute is that we didn't grow up in a household where that was in place and impacted by, and it was still really, really tough for us. I don't think that because you have siblings, you should then therefore be put in a poverty. Like, it's not a young person's fault how many like brothers and sisters they have.
So hopefully just another illustration of what child poverty means for young people, the people who are actually living and experiencing it. And watching that video gets me every time when Anastasia says that having dreams costs money. So she doesn't have dreams because she knows that her family can't afford to help her reach her goals. So she doesn't dare to dream. And I just think that's so incredibly sad that we're growing up in a society where so many children potentially feel like that because of government policy and choices that have been made within government. As part of the End Child Poverty Coalition, we publish every year data that looks at child poverty in each Westminster constituency and each local authority. And if you wouldn't mind putting the next slide up for me, please. This data is really helpful because it can demonstrate that some areas are much more likely to have high levels of child poverty than others. So I've just put the top, I think it's 21 constituencies on this slide, so you can just briefly see the areas that have the highest proportion of all children who are living in poverty. So we can see at the top, for example, Birmingham, Ladywood and the West Midlands, almost 62% of all children in that constituency will be living in poverty. You know, well over half of all those children will be experiencing things that those youth ambassadors were just explaining to us. This is, I just find this so shocking. And, you know, if you were to think about going into a school in that constituency, the majority of those children will be living in poverty. That school is probably having to deal with families who are experiencing, you know, crisis of finance. The school potentially is having to provide food for children out of their own budgets. There's all sorts of things that will be going on in that community to help those children, when in actual fact, you know, the cause of this is that the families just don't have enough income to pay for the children. And if you look down the list, one of the things that I've done here is to highlight which political party the MP is that represents that constituency. So you can see in this sort of like highest 21 constituencies, it is predominantly Labour that are representing those communities in Parliament. So this really is an issue for Labour and Labour MPs. And I kept it to 21 because you might see at the bottom there that the 21st constituency is Holborn and St Pancras, which is the Prime Minister's constituency. So again, showing that this is an issue for those at the highest level of government. They're representing people that are experiencing this, and a high proportion of children who are experiencing this. And then the final column on this table is looking at the 2-child limit to benefit payments and what proportion of children in each of those constituencies are living in a household that's been impacted by this policy. And we heard Sara talk about that at the beginning. Just to explain what this policy is, if a family is claiming universal credit and they have 3 or more children, and one or more of those children is born after April 2017, that family will not be receiving the child element for those children who sort of don't qualify, which means they're missing out on about £3,500 a year, which is obviously really vital income, which would help that family to afford winter coats, to afford food. We're talking about babies often that are impacted by this policy. So, to afford nappies and formula, all the things that children need. So where you have a high level of child poverty in a constituency, it is incredibly likely that there will also be a high number of children who are impacted by the 2-child limit in that constituency as well. As a coalition, we have worked together with all our members coming together to write a document which we've submitted to government, which lays out 8 tests that we are looking at with regards to the child poverty strategy when it's published later on, hopefully after the budget. We have outlined what we as the sort of wider sector want to see from government in terms of reducing child poverty. And I will share a link to that in the chat so you can see it, or a link will be shared. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of the different tests that we've set out for government. One is to have a strategy that has targets, which sounds sort of slightly obvious, really, but we are concerned that potentially this child poverty strategy will be published without any targets that have any kind of mechanism to make them targets that have to be met. And we want to see a reduction in child poverty. We want this strategy to really meet its aims and to have targets to reduce the number of children living in poverty. We also want the strategy to ensure that social security is really the bedrock of the strategy and is seen as the way to lift families out of poverty. And as a coalition, we have been really clear that the government must scrap the 2-child limit to benefit payments. And this must happen immediately and for all families who are impacted as a first step before increasing other elements of social security payments in order to lift families out of poverty. I just want to end by saying that if your organisation is interested in joining the coalition, we would really welcome you joining. So please do consider becoming a coalition member to help campaign to end child poverty in the UK. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. Really helpful. Also, to everyone joining us, please do pop any questions that you might have for our speakers later in the session in the Q&A section, which I think you've all got access to. We'd love to see any questions from you. So next, I'm going to move on to Louis Schuster-Farrell, who is Service Development and Change Manager at the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, to give a local government perspective. Thanks, Louis.
Thanks, Beatrice. Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. Apologies in advance. I'm a bit under the weather at the moment, so if I go a bit hoarse, bear with me. I work across a range of poverty and financial inclusion related areas of work at the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham. Are you okay to go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so for those that aren't familiar, we're a borough in East London. Barking and Dagenham is a proudly diverse London borough with a rich heritage. We're home to one of the fastest growing and youngest populations in the country, which is a source of great energy and potential. But we're also one of the most deprived boroughs, with poverty influencing many of our residents' lives. And we can see this clearly and sadly by the proportion of children living in poverty, the graph on the right. We've been above the London average since records began, and that gap hasn't narrowed. We're also the London Borough highest on the latest indices of multiple deprivation, which takes into account things like income, employment, skills, housing, health, and disability. Next slide, please. So poverty and deprivation are long-standing issues in Barking and Dagenham, but they're also multi-layered and complex. And we know that broadly, poverty is driven by costs that are too high and incomes that are too low, but there's a lot that sits behind this. And you can see from that infographic on the left of the screen, that we've got the second highest unemployment rate in the country, the highest proportion of adults in London with no qualifications, and the third highest rate of universal credit claimants in the country. Alongside this, we've got a very high proportion of under 16s, the highest in England and Wales. So coupled with high rates of low pay and low job density, it's clear to see why many households have been struggling. Adding to this, I think just more broadly, households that do struggle to make ends meet are disproportionately impacted by high cost increases on essentials, like we've seen over the last few years, including food, utilities and rent, and that's definitely the case in Barking and Dagenham. Alongside all of this, we've also historically been one of the more affordable London boroughs, and as such, people who are priced out of elsewhere in London often come to Barking and Dagenham. And between the census in 2011 and the one in 2021, our population's grown by 17.7% compared to an average of 7.7% across London. And there's lots of great benefits to being a growing borough, but it also brings challenges when it comes to supporting more people with higher levels of need. And the capacity to do this across the system, not just from the council, is a limiting factor to tackling child poverty. Also, what we found through our work is that there's, I think it's been mentioned already, but particular groups that are more vulnerable. So, for example, single parents, and we've got the highest proportion in England of single parents. Households where someone has a disability or long-term health condition, carers and care leavers, amongst others, are all groups that are definitely more vulnerable to the cost of living and poverty. And what we've also found is that there's a great deal of intersectionality. So therefore, lots of different unique combinations of challenges, and therefore supporting people is really complex. Next slide, please. In terms of looking at the impact, there's a lot that I could pull out to show the impact that all of this has, but I've picked these two graphs because I feel like they give a really strong indication of both the day-to-day and long-standing impacts of poverty. So on the right, over 5,000 residents have answered surveys on the cost of living in the last 2 years, and 25% have told us that they've gone at least one whole day without eating, and that figure's the same when we just look at the households that have children. So that's really stark and well above the kind of national average. On the left is healthy life expectancy. So you can see the impact on how long people are likely to live healthy, independent lives, with both male and female children born between 2018 and 2020 likely to live 5 years less in good health compared to the London average. So I think just from that, you can see there's a huge human impact. Thinking just in terms of what it means for us as an organisation, at the moment, roughly 7 in every £10 that the council spends goes on acute social care, and a big chunk of what's left goes on things like homelessness prevention and other support. Poverty is one of the main drivers for that statutory spend, and without addressing the root causes, people's circumstances get worse and they're more likely to need that kind of acute, crisis in-depth support, which then in turn limits our capacity to work in a more preventative way and support people upstream. Next slide, please. There's a number of key ways in which local government can help to address some of these issues, and I've just picked out 3 here. The first relates to working in a targeted way. So research tells us that there's a variety of reasons as to why the groups mentioned and others are inherently more vulnerable to poverty. We also know that the longer issues have been going on for, the harder it is to address. So in other words, reaching people at risk earlier is the best way to get maximum impact. Local authorities like ours possess a huge amount of data and interact with residents on a wide range of services, including areas like housing, social care, or the collection of debts like council tax. So using that data in an insightful and ethical way can help us spot red flags and reach people early with support. Secondly, complex issues often require long-term support. So many of the challenges people face are not ones that are going to be solved by filling out one form or through a single interaction. I think working relationally over time is critical to supporting some of the most vulnerable people. And working in a place means that local authorities can have the infrastructure to do that. That being said, I think that budget pressures and constraints can hinder the ability for local authorities to do this. And then finally, local authorities are key partners in their area. We can galvanise other organisations and use our resources to build capacity across the system and in the community to support a greater number of people in a better way than we could on our own. We're really well placed to join the dots. Leveraging social value from our suppliers and focusing it on key issues is a great example. Other times it's about understanding where we're maybe not the best placed organisation to deliver, and instead how can we facilitate others. So that can include things like providing a space for partners to work out of, or providing referral routes for organisations to use when they are supporting someone who needs it. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I suppose just building on those points, there's a lot of examples of work that we're doing in Barking and Dagenham to support residents, all alongside local businesses, community groups, and the voluntary sector. I don't have very long, I'm sure I'm overrun already. So lots of information is available on our website about some of this work, but I'll just focus on a few key examples that stick out. So one of these is our work to increase pension credit take-up. There, we identified a cohort of older people who could potentially claim pension credit but weren't, using the data that we had available to us. We then worked with a local community group who were best placed to support them in a more relational way. So carrying out home visits over time to not only help people access the benefits they're entitled to, but also to help them with other wider issues, things like utility bills. And the first 2 years we did this, we were able to get over £200,000 of pension credit awards to those who we identified. Another area of work that I just call out as well, I suppose, and it's on the slide. It's an area that we're really proud of as a council, but our efforts in what we call the local growth sectors. So they're areas of employment where there's potential for a growing number of good quality jobs, and they're listed there. We've got film studios that launched in Barking and Dagenham. There's construction, care, food. So our employment services run programs specifically targeted to strengthen pathways into those areas. So that might include providing upskilling and training opportunities tailored directly to those in order to support residents into a position where they could embark on a career in one of those sectors. So building on those examples and others, we've recently published our anti-poverty strategy. This aimed to help us work in a more targeted way, so identifying some of those cohorts I mentioned who are at particular risk from poverty. So, going back to that, it was single parents, care leavers, amongst others. Our aim is to spend this year trialling different projects to support these groups and using it as an opportunity to further understand the barriers that people face and what could be effective in addressing them. So I think I've definitely overrun my allotted time, and I'll draw my item to a close there, Beatrice, but thank you and happy to hear any points or answer any questions once we get to the Q&A. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Louis. Lots and lots to dive into in terms of the work in Barking and Dagenham. So last but by no means least, speaker for the initial presentations is Gail Irvine, who's Head of Business Development and Policy at the Living Wage Foundation. So really looking forward to hearing your perspective, Gail.
Thanks very much, Beatrice, and good morning, everyone. So the Living Wage Foundation, if you don't know us, is the organisation at the heart of the Real Living Wage campaign and movement in the UK. And we celebrate and recognise employers who pay the real living wage, which is the only wage rate which is calculated based on what it actually costs to live. It's independently calculated, and employers pay it on a voluntary basis to try and ensure that their lowest paid workers can afford their everyday needs. It's currently £12.60 an hour in the UK and £13.85 in London. But it increases, it changes every year in line with changes in the cost of living. Sadly, those have only ever gone up, and it continues to increase to try and help people meet rising costs. So the new rate will actually be announced tomorrow. But we accredit employers who pay this rate, and we also work with them on other anti-poverty interventions. For example, Living Hours, which is our accreditation designed to tackle insecure work. And the focus of what we do is working directly with employers, with business, for them to take the choices that are within their control to try and tackle poverty. So as speakers have already alluded to, obviously there are many, many actors that need to play a part in tackling child poverty, but my remarks will focus mostly on the role of business and employers. And I want to start just by going back to the beginning of the living wage movement and highlighting how families and children in poverty have always been powering this campaign. So the Living Wage campaign actually started 25 years ago, and it started with low-paid workers in the East End of London coming together and organising themselves because they had the shared experience of the impossibility of trying to make ends meet on minimum wage jobs. Many of them told us that they were working more than one minimum wage price job to try and provide for themselves and their family, but struggling to do so. And one of the key things that came up early on was not just the material impact of that, but the impact that that had on people's family lives, their ability to have any time left at all to spend with their families, with their children. And so those workers took action on local employers and called on them to go further than the government's minimum wage and pay the real living wage to help them meet their everyday needs and to thrive. As I say, that was 25 years ago, and over that time, we have had a huge impact in the UK. Today, we are a movement of over 16,000 accredited employers, and those employers have collectively put £4.2 billion into the pockets of low-paid workers in the form of additional wages. So we are extremely proud of that. We're still a growing movement, but needless to say, there is a but, and it's that there are still too many workers trapped in poverty. Particularly, there's stubborn pockets of low pay in a handful of sectors in the economy, and that feels to me one of the biggest challenges if we're going to try and address working poverty and child poverty, is how do we get some of these traditionally low paid sectors like hospitality, social care, manufacturing, how do we get them paying better wages? The continued cost of poverty on families and workers is huge. We recently conducted some polling asking about the experience of workers who are earning below the real living wage. And that showed that 59% of them in the last year had skipped meals. So going to Louis' point, that is a sadly common occurrence. Had struggled to heat their homes, were turning off their gas and electric because they couldn't afford their bills. We also found that 42% had turned to use a food bank in the last 12 months, and that rose to 56% of families with dependent children. And just to bring a bit more colour to this, I suppose, as I said, this campaign has always been rooted in the experience of families and children. We work with an amazing school in London called St Anthony's, who actually, the staff team are really supportive of the living wage. And they've worked with the kids to actually sing songs and put together music videos talking about the importance of the living wage as one thing to address poverty. And when I first started at this organisation a few years ago, the kids had a lyric in that song saying, "Are we going to heat or are we going to eat?" And the kids talked about overhearing and being so aware and so conscious of their parents arguing about money, stressing about money, not being able to come home in time to read them a bedtime story because they're working, again, multiple minimum wage jobs, trying to pull together an income that can provide for their families. So we know this is still a really big issue. And alongside the wage issue, the other side of the coin for us, and a really important area of focus, is this piece about living hours. Living hours is our employer accreditation designed to target insecure work. Because it's not rocket science. Even if you are earning a living wage, if you can't get enough hours, or if your hours fluctuate all the time, if you don't know when you're going to be working, it's extremely hard to plan your life, to command a decent income, to plan your finances. So there's 6.1 million workers in the UK who are in some form of insecure work. And of most concern to us is the fact that low-paid workers are 5 times as likely to be trapped in low pay and insecurity. That is a really, really difficult poverty trap to get out of. So that is a huge area of ongoing focus for us. And just to round this section off, I wanted to highlight some recent research conducted by JRF Scotland that speaks to our focus on wages and hours as 2 principal levers that employers can control. We would love to repeat this research at a UK-wide level. So if anyone in the audience is already doing this or thinking about this, it would be great to talk. But JRF Scotland were looking at what would be needed to shift the dial on child poverty in Scotland. And what they modelled the finding that if they moved all workers in Scotland onto the real living wage, that would lift about 10,000 children out of poverty. And according to their research, that is an impact equivalent to ending the 2-child limit. So that's really important. But perhaps unsurprisingly, what was more impactful was moving all the workers in Scotland onto the real living wage, but also parents increasing their working hours. That would lift 60,000 children out of poverty. So we need to address these two things together. It's both the hourly wage and the number of hours. And of course, we need to be mindful of what constrains people's ability to work, particularly parents, and the other actors that need to play a part in supporting people's to have an acceptable standard of living in that situation, so that no child is growing up in poverty. So I will draw it to a close there, just to state that for us, the focus is very much on what employers can do. We'll continue to work with as many employers as possible on living wage, on living hours, and in the sectors that need it most.
Huge thanks, Gail. And thanks to all of our speakers. Really, really interesting and valuable set of initial presentations. And thanks to everyone for the interaction in the chat and for your questions. Do keep them coming. I'll turn to the ones that we've got already next. So I think we've heard very clearly from speakers that it is possible to reduce child poverty, that something that urgently needs to happen in the UK, given the impact that we've heard about of the very high rates of child poverty at the moment, obviously on individuals, on children themselves, on families, but also on our wider society and economy. And we've heard that success in the past has been very much tied to government action to invest in the social security system, and that perhaps this is the biggest lever that needs to be pulled to reduce child poverty. We've heard as well very clear steps from Gail that all employers can take. But I wanted to come back to the first couple of questions we've had in from the audience to all the speakers about what else businesses in the private sector could be doing to play their part in reducing child poverty. So don't know if anyone wants to come in first on that.
I can come in on that, Beatrice.
Thanks, Gail.
So we are continuing to work with employers to try to see ways that we can work with them on a broader range of issues, because certainly there isn't a magic bullet to this. There is a lot of different interventions that can help to tackle poverty and build people's financial resilience across the life course. So at the moment, one thing that we're working on, we've taken on a project looking at an anti-poverty benchmark that would have a range of different actions employers can take, and looking at how we might mobilise that, kind of bring that to employers. What kind of recognition would they want? What would encourage them to? What would good practice look like actually on a range of issues? So some of the key issues that come up to us is flexibility, that is genuinely two-sided flexibility, not just all about what the employer wants, but trying to ensure that there is good practice, a good offer on flexible working for all workers, including the lowest paid, is one of those things that can help people to balance their work and their caring responsibilities, for example. And we know that a lot of people get trapped in low-paid roles because they get the part-time hours that they need to also look after their children, for example. So we need more roles to be offering all forms of flexibility. That's one thing, but we're also really interested in what employers can do with a better than statutory sick pay offer, because statutory sick pay, as many of you will know, is unbelievably low, historically and internationally low. I think it's about 10% of replacement income for the lowest paid workers, if they are entitled to it at all. I think more than 2 million are excluded from it. So that is an area that the UK government is taking some steps to improve the statutory availability, but the level is still extremely low. So that's one priority for us, is what can employers ensure that they offer as an occupational sick pay policy that can make sure people can actually take time off work when they need it to recover, but also that they don't fall immediately into poverty when they do, which is sadly happening too often.
Brilliant, thank you. I might just, while I've got you, Gail, stick with you, because another very related question has just come in. But then Louis, just a warning, I might come to you for the question about any specific examples of work you've done with suppliers. But just, Gail, really interesting question just come in about how to balance the need for secure work, sort of linked to the living hours question and point that you were making, and how to balance that with the need for flexible working arrangements, which you've also talked about as being really crucial to make sure people sort of have choice about their work and the flexibility there. So yeah, how do you balance that security with flexibility, both of which we know are really important for people?
So there is a lot in that. Certainly it is a balance. And I think one of the key things we're trying to achieve with our Living Hours campaign is to reset the balance somewhat, because so far the flexibility has mostly been in the control of the employer to say, can you turn up to work tomorrow morning? I need you, but also to drop people at the last minute's notice. So I think 55% of people get less than 1 week's notice of their shifts in the UK, for example, which is just mind-boggling in terms of how you can plan your life or your finances around that. I think for us, it's important to distinguish a few different aspects of security and flexibility. So some is about the contract type that someone has. So do they have guaranteed hours, or are they on a 0-hour contract? How many hours do they have? How many do they need? What balance do they need of working hours to balance their other responsibilities outside of work? But also where work takes place. I think one of the points I was making is that kind of remote and hybrid options are more available to higher paid workers than just part-time hours. And that's what traps a lot of people in lower paid part-time jobs. So it is a balance. There's trade-offs. One of the key things we always ask employers to do is actually speak to their workers. So we require them to make living hours, which involves 16 hours a week, unless the worker wants fewer than that, 4 weeks notice of their shifts, and a contract that reflects their actual hours worked. Employers have to go out and consult with their workers to make sure if anyone wants to opt out of that, because actually they do require more flexibility, or they don't need guaranteed hours. It's not a priority for them right now. So I'd say consulting with the workers is an important way to know how much the business need for flexibility can also flex to ensure you keep good people and you're making sure they have the wages and hours they need.
Brilliant, thank you. I think yes, absolutely possible to offer secure work and flexible work. So thanks for setting that out. Louis, I don't know if you want to come in with any more about work that you've perhaps been doing with businesses embarking in Dagenham, and also particularly suppliers to the local authority as well, because we've had a question about any examples of work with current suppliers that can help tackle child poverty.
Yeah, sure. I think first of all, on the point around businesses, I would just really echo that point about flexible working. It's been probably the most common barrier that's been raised to all the work that we've done across a multitude of different groups, both in terms of remote working and flexible hours. I think more businesses and employers, for example, advertising, instead of maybe they've got one role that they've really struggled to fill for a long time, advertising it as 2 part-time roles can really open up to people who do need to manage caring responsibilities, childcare, or other issues. So yeah, definitely. But I think that point's been well covered. In terms of suppliers, I think I was just in the process of typing a response, which I'm just going to hit send on, because we have got an annual social value impact report that people can look at. It's got loads of examples of the types of things that I've supported. But and I've replied to Heather's question with that. But I think kind of more generally from the local authority perspective, I think where suppliers and social value really comes into its own is kind of adding the capacity for us to support, like actually support the people we're trying to work with. Because often, we can identify people, we can find them. As our resources are more and more constrained, it's really difficult to then actually give them the meaningful support and put things in place. But for example, social value has been really critical for helping us run projects like cooking clubs. So where we've brought vulnerable people together to tackle isolation, hunger, and skills gaps through like donation of equipment and things like that to enable us to actually run projects. Or likewise, we've got from suppliers previously things like energy vouchers, so we can actually give them to families who are accessing other support that we've offered. And I think specifically there was a question around leisure and health. So I'd love to have more of a think about, but I would say one thing that comes to mind is the fact that, and I think it was mentioned in someone's item, but lots of children aren't able to access activities that their peers can. So thinking particularly around the leisure space, probably there's something there around supporting families that that we work with to access those activities could be a great way to bridge that gap. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Sara or Rachel, do you want to come in at all on the question about what businesses can do?
I guess I would just say one thing that comes up in lots of the families that we work with when they're talking about employment, and for a lot of them, it relates quite closely to their interaction with the DWP and the universal credit system. And so it's really, for us, we know that families will be able to stay in employment longer if it is able to reflect their needs, but also if there's opportunities to progress. So, you know, kind of like having those opportunities, even in lower paid jobs, for people to really get on at work, you know, thinking not just about security and flexibility in terms of what decent work means, but also, you know, often it's mums in particular, are they going to be able to have the support to get back after having time off? Are they, once they get there, going to be able to kind of move on so that it's a fulfilling career for them and that it justifies them being away from their children? And then I just, you know, a really fundamental point, you know, this is related to the flexibility, but it's, you know, that question of how many hours can we really expect parents to work when they've also got to look after their kids. And it's just like trying to find the way to get that balance right is really, really important. You know, and as we've heard, there's lots that we can do in employment, but, you know, it used to be the case that, you know, a decade ago, maybe a bit longer, governments would say employment is the route out of poverty. And it's not anymore. You know, it used to be that if you had one member of your, you know, a mum or a dad who was working, you know, maybe close to full time, then that would be enough to sustain a family, and the other parent wouldn't necessarily have to work, or wouldn't necessarily have to work full time. But now we're pretty much at the point where you kind of need both parents to be working full time if you're on one of those lower paid jobs in order for them to be able to get by. And you know, that fundamental shift is something that employers, decent employers, can play a role in helping to address a little bit.
And just quickly to add from me, I would say that we often hear from government that, you know, we don't have the money to lift children out of poverty. It costs too much money. We don't have the budget to do it. And often it's the charity sector making the case for why actually we need to reduce the number of children living in poverty. But obviously keeping children in poverty and families living in poverty has a cost on business as well. And one of the things I think that it's really important for businesses to do is to highlight the cost of poverty to that business and what impact families living in poverty is having on that business, whether it, you know, bills that can't be paid or that sort of thing. And just to highlight what the impact of child poverty is sort of in every way possible, to show government that children do need to be lifted out of poverty. And without sounding like a broken record, you know, joining the coalition, you can join as a business if you would like, if child poverty is something that you're working on as well through your business. So you'd be very welcome to join us and support us in the campaign that we do.
Thanks, everyone. So hopefully some really helpful responses there around, you know, thinking about your role as employers and also using your voice to highlight the impact of child poverty as well on business. There's a couple of questions from Susan that I wanted to come to. I might come back to you first, Sara, if that's okay. So child poverty is complex. If you had to suggest high impact interventions which have the potential to shift the life outcomes of a 4 to 5-year-old, example, so focused on that child, what would you recommend? And I think really linked to that as well, it'd be really interesting to hear a bit more about how much I think the sort of, in terms of policy solutions, the focus should be on access to employment.
Thanks for those questions. So in terms of how to have an impact on 4 and 5-year-olds, it will impact the rest of their lives. I probably said this at the start because I always say it. And you know, there's a huge body of evidence about the impact that poverty has on a person's childhood, but also their life chances. And you know, you will do significantly worse in your GCSEs if you grow up in poverty. There was a study published 3 years ago that actually kind of tracked outcomes up until about the age of 30, and at every point a person who had been in receipt of free school meals, which was used as a proxy for poverty, they would probably get worse grades at school. Even if they got the same grades, they probably wouldn't go to university or to as high ranked university. Even if they went to university and got their degree, the salary that they had would be less than their peers who hadn't been on free school meals. So that impact of poverty tracks right through a person's health outcomes, but educational outcomes. So, the government is rightly thinking about things that it can do that focus on things like school readiness. But fundamentally, you can't separate a child and their outcomes from poverty. And the best way to ensure that they will have a successful education is to make sure that both when they're younger, but then as they continue through into adolescence, and I think we often forget about teenagers, but the impact is still there, doing whatever we can to support that family with the costs and support their income. In terms of what, we do a lot of work in schools. We run a project called The Cost of the School Day. So there are lots of things that schools, for example, can do to reduce costs of school trips, to support families and to make sure they're getting their free school meal entitlement, to reduce uniform costs. And actually the government has taken some quite good steps on this already. And similarly, the expansion of early hubs, I think, is going to be really, really positive. Again, the evidence from the previous Labour administration shows that when you invest in what are kind of effectively universal services that exist in a community, but that families who need a bit more support can access, that will have a bit of a relatively small, but still, like, for those children, a worthwhile impact on their educational outcomes. But it is, in terms of looking overall at the effectiveness of interventions, lifting and keeping kids out of poverty is the best thing to do. And there's been a lot of research into other educational interventions and the extent to which they can make up for the fact that a child is living in an unequal situation, and they can't. Basically, the evidence shows that we haven't found a way through the education system to make up the inequality that exists as a result of income inequality. And very quickly, because I know the others will have stuff to say, on the question of access to employment, access to decent employment is obviously, it's really, really important. We've heard here what a role it can and should play. Government needs to get it right. It's really important that government doesn't treat it as a question of just getting people into any job, because we know that doesn't work for parents. We know that where the opportunities aren't there for that job to continue to be a decent one, then it doesn't work. So I think really understanding the barriers that parents face in the labour market and tailoring support services to their needs is really important. But crucially, that does cost money as well. And I think, we can talk about getting people into employment, but in order to impact that at scale, government would need to spend a lot more money on it than it is willing to spend at the moment, as with lots of things.
Thanks, Sara. That's brilliant. And I'm really conscious of time. I think we've got a couple of minutes left. I just wonder if we've had another really interesting question in from Andrea about what support is there for self-employed people in poverty across different sectors. I didn't know if Gail or possibly Louis might want to come in and just say something about self-employment.
I'm happy to come in on that. I was going to say again, I know, to be honest, I think this is a gap. There's information on definitely Money Helper. I can find it and put it in the chat afterwards, but they have got a page, I know, around support for people who are self-employed, but I think that's limited to support with universal credit, ESA, and that's about it, to be honest. And budgeting help, I think it is a gap. Unfortunately, sorry, it's not a very good answer, I realise, but I'll put that link in the chat anyway, because it does kind of outline what support is available. But I don't think there's anything out there that I'm aware of that specifically does support self-employed people when it comes to social security.
Thanks, Louis. Final minute, I suppose. Would anyone just like to round off with any final comments or thoughts in response to any of the discussion that we've had today, which has been really good, so thank you, and really wide-ranging. But yes, anything from you, Gail, to finish?
Yeah, I was just going to chip in on that point about the self-employed, and it's similarly, it feels like a big gap. the face of self-employment has changed a lot in the last 15 years or so, and there are still now so many more people who are self-employed and low paid and in poverty. So at the Living Wage Foundation, as I described it, our focus has always been on trying to get the most out of the employment relationship and the employer's responsibility. And the rise of low paid self-employment and also kind of bogus forms of self-employment like the gig economy is kind of getting in the way of that. So it's something that we are grappling with about how can we also raise employment standards for people who are self-employed or in these more contested forms of work in the gig economy. So a big area of focus for us over the next few years is trying to get into that.
Brilliant, thank you. Rachel, any final comments from you?
I was just going to come back on the question about which families are most likely to experience poverty, and this is quite well documented, and it's really sad, but also there is a link with intersectionality here. So if you fall into perhaps two of these groups, then you're more likely to experience poverty. But we know that if a family member is disabled, if you come from a Black or minority ethnic background, single parent family, larger families, and refugee and migrant families, for example, are those that are much more likely to experience poverty. And talking about single parent families, we know that the majority of single parent families that are in poverty are likely to be headed by a female. So it is also very much linked to women's rights and women's issues. And in a way, you can't really separate child poverty from women's issues because the two are so closely linked. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much. And I know we're due to finish now, so I will wrap it up there. I think we've managed to cover, thanks to our speakers, all of your questions. So thank you for putting those to us and for joining the session. Hope you found it useful and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.